Okay, we got a question here, Jeremy, from Davi Quintella. I've always wondered, can the jurors deliberate daily, or do they all have to keep their opinions to themselves until it's time to deliberate for the decision?
First off, you have to let me go backwards and take those Vegas handicap odds that all of you got to go through
I'm
there.
sorry, you're
And
right. I didn't
I just
let you
want
do
to
it.
say,
Yeah, your turn.
no, I'm going to bet heavy with both Afi and Melba on that one.
Okay.
I already Venmoed them some money for this while I was waiting to jump in, but I think their assessment is 100% on. It's fairly obvious that we have a case on the lower level charges, but the multitude of charges that they can choose from on the RICO is going to just make it very difficult for the defense there, regardless how much they muddy the water on credibility with Jane, because they don't need Jane to find him guilty. And I think that weaves in nicely to the second part of the question, which is if you don't believe Jane, essentially, and this is probably one of the few places where you can bifurcate her from the rest of the case. And there are other witnesses, people that had drug induced experiences or substance abuse issues that muddy their memories. And so I do think that you can cleave off a lot of that. In most cases, you can. In most cases, people are inextricably linked to one another. In this case, I really think you can cleave a lot of it. And then the prosecution can have a much more cleaner closing. But when it comes to jurors having that important conversation, it's when they go into that back room. That's the oath. The oath is that they don't deliberate until they go back there. So a lot of these issues we're discussing about credibility, they'll have, and they're going to have day in and day out as a group. But don't be surprised if we hear later when certain jurors decide to talk that you end up having these side conversations, right? And I've been trying to get into a jury room as a former prosecutor, as a defense attorney. I got jury duty coming up in under a month, and boy, would I love to be back there. And I talk to
Yeah.
jurors all the time. Well, you'll have two or three people talking, and then another four people talking, and five people talking, and then they'll start bubbling up and arguing. And so you want it to be organized, but in a case like this, there's so much to go through. There's so much to dissect. There's so much to analyze that you have to imagine there are probably going to be some splinter factions or side conversations, but eventually that'll all filter into the main conversation once everybody feels like they've had their voice heard, once everyone feels like they have a good understanding of what the arguments between the jurors are before reaching a unanimous decision if they can.
Interesting timing, right? Because it's now being reported per CNN that the prosecution has officially rested their case in the Sean Combs criminal trial. In fact, Prosecutor Comey has said to the court, we've essentially rested. We only may want to move for a few corrections. So what is happening now? Well, Mark Agnifilo, one of Sean Combs' defense attorneys, is asked by the judge, are you ready to move? Combs attorney Alexandra Shapiro says we move under Rule 29, which I mentioned before. Inference is not enough. They cite a case, and they say on count one, Mr. Combs is entitled to a judgment of acquittal. Basically, again, don't even send this to the jury. There is nothing for the fact finder to decide. You take everything that has been presented over the last 7 weeks. They have not met the burden. So they said Mr. Combs is entitled to a judgment of acquittal. The requirements of RICO have not been met. They have not shown the agreement to violate RICO, nor agreement to 2 racketeering acts. That's interesting, Melba. So they're saying there was no criminal agreement between Sean Combs and others to engage in a pattern of illegal activity, no agreement between him and others to violate 2 of the racketeering acts, sex trafficking, forced labor, bribery, arson, kidnapping. Where do you think this is going to go? You said there's no chance the judge is going to grant it, but I am curious what these arguments are going to be.
Yeah, so I'm just checking my notes right quick because I'm trying to see in terms of the. Okay, so it was intended. Okay, the government has to prove that 2 racketeering acts were or were intended to be committed as part of conspiracy. And they don't have to prove that the defendant is the one who committed it. Um, and they don't even have to prove that he agreed to commit any of the acts. So I think that's where you might have some daylight, is to be able to say, listen, all of these things were done at his behest. He didn't necessarily have his fingers in the day to day. And so that kind of might get around the whole agreement, right? And also, when you say agreement, does it have to be a tacit agreement? Do they have to sit down and shake hands and be like, all right, here's what we're going to do, right? We're going to do these freak offs and I'm going to take the lead and no, like
No.
I think the agreement and the conspiracy comes from the actions and the repeated actions, right? Like, not like this was a one-off, but like, for instance, Christina Coram continually booked these flights for the sex workers, continually made sure that narcotics were present for Diddy for everything that he needed, continued to kind of intercede whenever Cassie was freaking out and wanted to leave, or wanted some kind of assistance, trying to keep her at bay and all of that. So I think there's ways for the jury to be able to come to the conclusion that the defendant Diddy is guilty of racketeering, meaning, again, if there's a jury question, then the case has to go to the jury. If there's no jury question, it's a different issue, then the motion to dismiss would be granted. But again, I see a jury question here, so I don't see that the judge is going to grant this.
So Shapiro continues, the enterprise is more than a group of people. The enterprise's purpose here maps onto the Racketeering Act, sex trafficking, etc. See the Boyle case, a structural feature of a RICO enterprise, a hub and spoke, the rim. Here, it is a rimless hub. Afi, your reaction?
So I was looking into that. What makes up a criminal enterprise? You don't have to be a part of the LLC or the INC. It's anyone. It's his staff, yes, but it's anyone who is affiliated in such a manner that they become a part of the enterprise. Could Jane even be part of the enterprise? Could Cassie be a part of the enterprise? And she was signed with Bad Boy. But these are people who are so enmeshed with Diddy and his businesses that they are part of the enterprise. I don't think that there is a question that there is a criminal enterprise. And to what Melba was saying about the conspiracy, you don't have to sit down and agree. Like, we know when we think of criminal conspiracy, we think of two or more people sitting down and saying, hey, we're going to wear masks, we're going to buy these guns, and we're going to attack this bank, or we're going to attack this 7-Eleven. You don't have to do that. It doesn't have to be that obvious and explicit. There are tacit conspiracies. And I think that's what we have here, agreeing to book these hotels, agreeing to set up this transportation. And something I think also, if I can talk about Jane and how we don't need Jane to get these convictions, but or I say we, oh my goodness, the prosecution doesn't need Jane to get these convictions. I think what Jane's testimony shows is his growth. I think by the time he got to Jane, he was very organized, and everybody on the team who was involved in his peculiar tastes knew what to do. And I think that's one thing of many things that her testimony showed, is that he has now gotten to a place where he already knows the resistance that he's going to get and from the alleged victims, and he knows how to execute. He knows how to get the rooms. He knows who he wants. He knows what to do and say to get them to do what he wants them to do, and everybody is on board for that.
Got another update from court. Shapiro says there is insufficient proof to establish this 20-year-long conspiracy. Mr. Combs did not conspire with any other person. They say an inner circle of bodyguards, but they failed to show it. There's only thin proof they engaged in crimes. Jeremy, your reaction?
I think, just like Afi was saying, when Diddy is the obvious beneficiary, and essentially the main beneficiary, the only beneficiary of this organized activity, it makes it very difficult to say that all of his underlings that were preparing these freak-offs, that were flying people places, that frankly were paying off or accepting bribes to not release video, which they did, that they weren't working in concert with each other. And like Afi said, it's not like the cartel, right? And I've defended cartel members in federal court, and you get voicemail messages and cash drops and stuff like that. But they can't even prove that everyone knows each other. You do it by the surrounding circumstances. You do it by judging people's actions, people bringing cash to a certain house. They may not know what drugs are being picked up or the quantity, but their job is to drop off the cash. And here, everyone in his organization had a job. And that was something the prosecution, I thought, actually succeeded in showing, is that their credibility only matters to a certain point, because when your job is to organize the freak-off and the freak-off gets done, that's it. It doesn't matter what your opinion of it was. And I think that's why, to Afi and to Melba's point, the deeper we got into this trial, the more it crystallized this idea over time of Puffy's maturation and growing this enterprise.
Yeah, what they're trying to establish, the prosecution, is essentially, it's like the mafia, right? And he's the boss, and he had underlings, and they were carrying out crimes, and he might not have, committed the crimes himself, but there was an understanding about what was going on. It was to benefit the family. It was to benefit him. You benefit him, everybody else benefits. But they are poking holes in this. And I have to tell you, these arguments are really important because we're finally now applying all the evidence to the charges. We are getting a sense of what closing arguments will look like, particularly for the defense. And we're going to hear from the prosecution too. They're going to respond to this motion as well. But I'll give you an example. So Shapiro says, at most, these were personal quantities of drugs. They used a lot of Astroglide and baby oil and drank maybe some drugs. Jonathan Perez said hotel nights were personal time with a female. Brendan Paul said hotel for the night. David James said he saw a naked man in the hotel room but thought that wasn't part of his job. The sex with Cassie Ventura and Jane sometimes involved third parties, but they were not booked by staff. It brought them closer to Combs. That idea, Melba, of saying this was all personal, that it wasn't Sean Combs using his businesses or his bodyguards or his inner circle to facilitate this, that's how they try to get away from racketeering, right? They say it wasn't part of this criminal enterprise, a common purpose. He's a celebrity. He engaged in some behavior, but it's not a federal crime. And they're, at the very least, they're saying it's not racketeering. What do you make of these arguments?
Well, it kind of flies in the face of the evidence because I think we all remember when the security guard from the Intercontinental Hotel was testifying and talking about how when that trade-off for the tape occurred and, the money was handed over, the cash counter was put there and everything else. And his bodyguards, Diddy's bodyguards, were standing behind him as he was signing the NDA agreement. So those bodyguards are not like personal employees. They're part of the broader structure of Bad Boy Entertainment, right? So you have that. You have Christina Quorum, again, chief of staff. She's not his personal assistant, right? This is somebody who works for the organization. And she was integral in booking the flights and doing all of that. So, and then Capricorn Clark. So again, it just flies in the face of the evidence. I think the defense is trying to gloss over a few things, but again, that's their job. They got to do what they got to do to try to get this case tossed for Diddy. And again, I don't think it's going to be successful.
And this is something, an update we just got from court, where it was very clear what they were trying to do with these summary witnesses, saying these assistants of Sean Combs, his inner circle, they weren't a part of all this. He was trying to keep it a secret. Shapiro says, Jane said to Cabral Williams, don't want team to intercept you. And in May, Jane said she had to wait for the assistants to clear out. When KK and the guards learned of Mr. Combs' violence to Cassie Ventura, it's not racketeering. They did not help. So, Alfie, I can ask you about this, or I can ask you a question we got from Nestdog. Can Johnson & Johnson sue Puffy for ruining baby oil for everyone? You want to talk about racketeering? You want to talk about whether or not Johnson & Johnson can sue Puffy? But up to you, which one you want to handle.
I'll talk about the Johnson & Johnson. You can ask me the second one if you like, but I think, kind of like we talked about attorneys earlier, even if you lose, you win, because you show up in court every day, you make a good effort, you do, you make proper objections, you do your research. And, even like, let's look at Brian Steele. He came on this case because we know him from the YSL trial. Even though he didn't get a not guilty verdict, he got something favorable, right? But it wasn't just a clear win. So you always win. And I think the same can be applied in this situation with Johnson & Johnson. Look at us. We're showing Johnson & Johnson now. All press is good press. This is, $100 million worth of press that they don't have to pay for. And we know it's a good product because he used it over a 20-year period. Hello? That's a hell of an endorsement from a billionaire and a mogul. Boom.
Why is Jeremy shaking his head no?
Because the real victim here is Astroglide, because no one's even talking about them. Well, as their lawyer, I should probably note the fact that while Johnson & Johnson and their apparently excellent tube of baby oil is getting that recognition, as the attorney for Astroglide, I'd like to make sure we get the same recognition.
Do you actually represent Astroglide?
In this suit, I probably do. I mean, I'm matching the Johnson & Johnson as we're talking. I mean, I didn't mean to match the baby oil that you put on the screen. It was very unintentional, but it happened today. It happened.
I'm glad we made it happen like that.
It It happens.
I just think that
Same thing would
Johnson and
happen.
Johnson and I was gonna say I just think that Johnson and Johnson Astroglide should put some money on Diddy's commissary when he gets convicted.
I mean,
I like the way you think.
look, we joke around about it, but it's the truth of the matter is this amount of oil, I mean, is it evidence of this sex trafficking operation? It was strange that he had so much on his property, strange he had him when he was ultimately arrested, or is this just, hey, he's engaging in different kind of behavior than everybody else? I mean, it's something that was focused upon, and I remember when there was the press conference by Damian Williams when the indictment was first announced, it was in all of the indictments. It's kind of this weird aspect to it, but the jury has to wonder, is this part of a sex trafficking operation or not? And it's really interesting to make sense of it. You know, Jeremy, I have to ask you, as we listen to what the arguments for why there's no racketeering, you also wonder what the arguments are going to be why they say there's no sex trafficking. And I'm very curious to hear why they say this is not Mann Act violations. We'll get to that in a second. We did get a super chat question. Jeremy, I'll throw this to you. Kelly Bezick says, Kelly, thank you so much. Do defense attorneys do defense attorneys have go-to narratives for these cases? It feels repetitive across other cases.
I don't want to gloss over what you just brought up because I think it raises an extra point real quick about the baby oil, which is the fact is the baby oil is really important because it shows a level of organization. When someone is hoarding that amount of baby oil, the prosecution is going to say, because we don't want to run out. It shows the frequency. It shows the intent to make sure it's always in stock. And so the defense attorney may do what you just did and kind of gloss over it and say it doesn't matter. But I think the prosecution is going to. And don't forget, in the very infancy of this case, there was that suspicion about whether there was GHB, a date rape drug, and whether that was used in the baby oil essentially to transmit it. And we never heard any evidence of that.
Well, yeah, Cassie even said, I think it was Cassie who said that that wasn't the case. So that was kind of disproved. Yeah.
It was 100% disproved. But the important point being is that he complained about it not being in stock. This was part of his regimen, so to speak, right? But to get to the listener's question, I think the issue for us as defense attorneys is, and I think Melba's been saying it all day, you figure out what fact you can hammer and hammer and hammer to beat the beyond a reasonable doubt. You're going to talk about witnesses' credibility. You're going to tell your own narrative of how people twisted some of these facts to paint you in a light that's not favorable to you and untrue. But ultimately, you're going to pick those one or two things. I don't care how long the trial is. And as a defense attorney, and you're going to hammer and hammer and hammer on it, and then try to use those to chip away at the rest of the case. There's no theme that applies to every case. It's simply finding those one or two things, and you pull and you pull and you pull until you can show the jury that the best parts of the government's case are actually the worst.
Update from court. Shapiro argues there's no proof that Christina Coram knew or thought these women were being coerced. She did damage control. There's evidence that Mr. Combs was lying to her. KK is supposed to be the main co-conspirator, but she only appears in March 2016. Wow, so 12 years in, that's what they say. Interesting argument. Okay, super chat question from Sydney Sexton. Sydney, thank you so much. Melba, will the prosecution have to correct the record on Mia's perjury, as previously argued by the defense, that can help the motion of acquittal? Now, I remember there was a motion where they said that maybe it was Mia, maybe it was Brianna Bongolan had perjured themselves. That wasn't something that I was introduced to the jury, so I'll give you an opportunity to respond to that. Again, will the prosecution have to correct the record on Mia's perjury, as previously argued by the defense, that can help the motion of acquittal?
Yeah, I don't think that's going to be an issue because, like you said, Jesse, it wasn't something that was brought up in front of the jury. I believe there was an objection to some of her testimony or something along those lines. And of course, then it goes into the realm of closing arguments where, again, both sides will say, listen, things were a little hectic during that time. There was a lot of drug use. She was traumatized. And I believe this has to do actually more so with Brianna in terms of the timeline as to when she was dangled over the balcony and the defense coming back and saying, listen, we have receipts showing that he was in a whole different state when you said that this happened. So, but again, she came back on redirect being like, I did not lie about anything. Maybe the dates were off, but I didn't lie. So I don't think that there's anything there that the prosecution is going to have to correct on the record for the jury. But I think they will need to refocus the jury's attention in closing to say, listen, Brianna got up and talked about the traumatizing experience that she had. Granted, this was a long time ago and there was drug use, but it doesn't mean it didn't happen, or something along those lines. You have to smooth it in a way that doesn't draw excessive attention, but the defense is going to get up and hammer her credibility in their closing. So you need to address it to kind of take the sting out of it.
Update from court. Shapiro says there's no evidence between the breakup with Cassie in 2018 and the beginning with Jane in 2021. Even for a RICO conspiracy, they have to prove a single agreement. It hasn't been done here. These are arguments that we were talking about would be made by the defense. We've been talking about it for the last 7 weeks. I think it's fascinating, Afi, that they mentioned KK. They mentioned Christina Quorum, that she is the main co-conspirator, but she only appears in a limited context. They didn't bring up so far that she wasn't called as a witness. But obviously, we all thought that that's what the government's argument was, right? That KK is the main co-conspirator here.
So to get a conviction on this racketeering conspiracy, do you need a main co-conspirator, or do you need all or even just a few of the co-conspirators? I think you just need a few. I think KK would have been great to testify, better and more impactful than these summary witnesses, but we don't need her. Again, I feel like I'm trying this case. Also, aside from the sex trafficking, you've got the kidnapping, you've got the prostitution, you've got the drug acquisition and transportation, you have possibly arson, you have so many things. You don't need KK. And also, can we talk about the Astroglide and the Johnson & Johnson really quickly? I just want to.
I thought we would never get back to it. I'm so glad you did. Let's talk about it.
I doing favors here. I'm just thinking, like, I do want to know what it was for. And like it was mentioned earlier, nobody asked what it was for. But I want to know, why didn't they ask Jane, and why didn't they ask Cassie to testify? Does he use this in his personal regimen? Is there a reason that he needs to have it on hand? And I will submit that they couldn't even answer that, because they were only tools to his personal peculiar proclivities. They
Yeah,
didn't
no,
know him intimately, so they didn't
yeah.
know what he was like at home.
I mean, I think they're basically saying we all know what he was using it for, Afi, right? He was using it for these sexual episodes, whether they're freak offs or wild king nights, but it doesn't make it a crime.
But not moisturization. You know,
How
I really want to know, like, did
how
he?
much dry skin does he have? I mean, that's yeah, of course. Well, here's what's interesting. Here's what's interesting. As we're listening to these arguments, you do wonder, Melba. We got a question from Casey. Who do you think's going to do the closing for Diddy? Again, I say the closing is so important in this case. Who do you think's going to do it for him?
I'm somewhere between Tenny Garagos, because she has been pretty much the lead and she really has done some killer cross examinations over the course of this case. I think that she really has that 30,000-foot view and would deliver a very impactful closing argument. So I'm between her or Brian Steele, because he brings the funk, right? Like, he comes and he brings the style, he brings the swagger, he's entertaining and all of that. And you're obviously going to want your best person out there doing this closing arguments, because again, we all know this case is going to rise and fall on closing arguments. So I'm somewhere between the two of them.
Got an update from court. Shapiro says even if the court denies this Rule 29 motion, some should not go to the jury. Under the California law, the government had to show that the information was about to be given to law enforcement. Back in April, you found lack of probable cause. I think what they're saying, Jeremy, is something to do with, I don't know, obstruction, bribery, tampering with a witness, right? I still say, if you talk about an underlying crime of racketeering and you talk about Eddie Garcia, the hotel security worker who was essentially paid to hand over the security footage of that beating from Sean Combs to Cassie Ventura, that's one of the more straightforward underlying predicate crimes that the prosecution should focus on. I don't know if this is exactly what Shapiro's referencing, but do you think that there was substantial evidence of obstruction or bribery or tampering with a witness?
There 100% was. And I don't think that is going to be really up for debate. There's no counter narrative that's been put before the jury to explain some of that activity. I mean, it was obviously a cover up. There's been other incidents that you haven't even mentioned where he's engaged in attempting to cover up his behavior. And so that's all going to the jury, right? And that could also be one of the main driving factors in why he may choose not to testify. Because if Diddy doesn't take the stand, then at least the narrative from the defense team is that they can paint it however they choose. You know, one of the things about lawyers, and this may sound a little ridiculous, is if the defendant doesn't testify, we can say whatever we want to about the case. We can tell whatever story we want to. We can tell multiple stories or multiple interpretations of how we have viewed the evidence or how the jury should view the evidence. But once you put Diddy up there, you're forcing the jury to choose between narratives of what Diddy said and what the witness said. And that's a really dangerous place to be as a defense attorney, because then your client has to be credible. And so if he gets on the stand, a lot of that obstructive behavior, that interference, ends up becoming fruit of cross-examination and is very dangerous territory.
So, okay, we got an update from court. Shapiro says, Mr. Combs was seeking to avoid negative publicity both for himself and Ms. Ventura. There was no police involvement. The guard who testified said Ms. Ventura did not want to report it. Ms. Ventura said the same thing, as did Kerry Morgan. Again, another pivotal instance going back to the 2016. Was it him, Afi, trying to cover up a crime, or was it him trying to avoid negative publicity as a celebrity?
Can it be both? I don't even think that we can even consider Cassie saying that she wanted him to do this, or she encouraged it, because we've already argued that she has some sort of battered woman syndrome or Stockholm syndrome, or she was under the control of Diddy. So I don't even think that's even a valid argument. But I think it's both. I think it's him covering up a very obvious crime, and also he's a public figure. This would destroy him, as we've seen. It has destroyed him since it's come out. It's destroyed his image and his ability to do business. So I think it can be both.
Melba, update. Eddie Garcia said the money was for the video, nothing more. Ms. Ventura appeared on FaceTime and said she had a movie coming out and didn't want this video coming out. The NDA permitted Garcia to report to law enforcement. So again, they're attacking this underlying predicate crime of bribery or tampering with a witness for racketeering. They're really getting granular, as they should. They're making compelling arguments. You don't think the judge is going to be persuaded, though?
No, I don't. Because again, even though that NDA allowed Eddie Garcia to go report to law enforcement, was he going to? Right? Because it's not like they sat down with him and an attorney. Let's go line by line. Let me explain to you what this NDA means. Here's what you can talk about. Here's what you can't. He literally signed it under duress because he had two large security guards that were not letting him out of the room. And there was a money counter and everything kind of giving you Scarface vibes. I mean, he's signing this because he just wants to get out of the room and get this over with. So them kind of relying on that argument that, he chose not to report to law enforcement is very much akin to, well, she being Cassie, not to report to law enforcement because, whatever, no crime occurred, or she was trying to avoid negative publicity. No, she was in the throes of a domestic violence relationship, and there were coercive factors at play. Same thing with Eddie Garcia. While there was no relationship, he was basically coerced into signing that agreement. So the judge is going to see through that, and it's not happening.
Okay, final point. Give it to Jeremy. What do you think the prosecution's going to argue in response to this motion?
They're going to argue that they've called sufficient witnesses, they've put forth sufficient facts, and they've made a prima facie case. And I don't think they're going to have that big of a mountain to climb here. I mean, the bottom line is that even if the defense team has muddied the waters to bring up credibility issues for Jane or bring up credibility issues for Cassie, we all agree, all four of us, that there isn't a debate as to transporting sex workers. There isn't a debate to transporting Cassie and Jane, even if you don't believe her as to some things, for sex. And so once you distill this down to its very, very, like you said, the granular form, I don't think the prosecution is all that worried at this stage. I think where they are going to be worried is making sure that the jury understands racketeering, and that to make sure that when the jury goes back, they don't always have to agree on what the predicates were, so that there's not confusion about things that really is not their job to decide.
Final update from court. And by the way, I say final. What we're going to do is we're going to take a break, and when we come back, we're going to get Elizabeth Milner on as soon as we possibly can because she's been in that courtroom. But Combs' attorney Shapiro says on obstruction, they have to show intimidation or threats to hinder or delay, cites a case. There must be consciousness of wrongdoing. Here are the incidents involving Mia and Jane. On Mia, there's not actus reus, meaning an action that fulfills an element of a crime. So listen, we're going to continue to monitor this. We're waiting to get Elizabeth back up. I do have to sign off my fantastic guests, Afi Patterson, Melba Pearson, Jeremy Eldridge. Thank you all so much for coming on. Really appreciate your insights. Thank you